All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce myself really quickly. My name is Josh Labus, and I am a junior biology major here at Oglethorpe. And today I'm going to be talking to you guys about fluvial sediment and nutrients, which is just river sediment and nutrients, and their effects on coral reef ecosystems. And so the reason I decided to focus on this question is because right now I'm currently in freshwater ecology, and a few semesters ago I actually took marine ecology. So I've had my fair share of ecology in terms of both of these types of ecosystems. And I wanted to really see if there was a connection between how fluvial sediment and nutrients affect freshwater ecosystems and whether or not that can actually impact coral reef ecosystems, which are a lot further away and not as connected as you would think. But this studies kind of show how they are connected. Okay, so we're just going to continue from there into my outline. And so to start off, I'm just going to go over some background information and an introduction into some key terms and things that everyone needs to know in order to kind of understand what's going on here. And then I'm going to go into two different studies. So the first study is over river discharge on a gradient in terms of coral richness and density. And that was conducted in Palau, which I'll go into in a little bit. And the second study is on sediment and nutrient discharge in coral reefs, which was conducted in Puerto Rico. And then following that, I'm just going to go over a couple points and a take-home message, make sure everyone understood everything that was going on in my presentation, and just some key points to take away. And then obviously following that is going to be my references. So to go ahead and get into this background information, I'm going to start with runoff because that's kind of the most broad and simple topic to understand just from the get-go. So runoff is just when water flows over land, over the top of land, or either through the soil into freshwater ecosystems or marine ecosystems. So this can either be caused by rainfall, flowing from higher elevations to lower elevations, and things like that. So focusing on runoff in terms of nutrients and sediment is actually one of the most important things to this question that I wanted to focus on. Because as runoff water flows over the top of land or through soil, it picks up nutrients and sediment as it goes from this higher elevation to lower elevation, which I wanted to show to everyone in this picture on the right-hand side. It kind of gives you a visual of how this water can flow from higher elevation to lower elevation. You can see if rainfall falls from the top in mountains and ridges and things like that, this water flows down through freshwater streams and rivers and over the land and picks up this excess nutrients and sediment along the way. And so I really wanted to see how that would affect river ecosystems, but not only affect river ecosystems, but how that could possibly affect coral ecosystems, which you'll see later in my presentation. They're actually very connected. So just kind of going into one of the most important topics, but also one of the most hard to understand topics is going to be watersheds. And so basically, watersheds are just the surrounding area of freshwater streams and rivers, and lakes as well, any body of water. It's going to be the surrounding area to a certain point. It's going to include all of the vegetation, the riparian area, which is just the area along the sides of either the stream, river, or lake. And so these watersheds it's just the land area surrounding it. But the most important concept to grasp when focusing on these watersheds is the elevation. So if you look at this graph in the bottom left-hand corner, it's going to be from a study that I'm going to go over in a little bit. But each of the dark black lines represents the boundaries of a watershed. And so obviously these boundaries are going to be signified by higher elevation. Because this water flows obviously from higher elevation to lower elevation with gravity. And each, depending on the shape of the land and everything like that, you get different flows of water. So each of these little sections, as you can see, has a different flow of water in terms of the elevation. So that's basically what a watershed is. I'll get into it a little bit more as I talk with the studies and how all of that works as well. But just focusing on how this can actually impact river ecosystems and coral ecosystems. So obviously sediment is not going to be good for freshwater ecosystems, high sediment levels, high suspended sediment levels, because it's going to make the water very murky and not as habitable for these photosynthesizing organisms, which form the base of the food web in almost every ecosystem around the globe. So with these higher sediment levels, it's going to create a block. So sunlight cannot actually reach these algae and phytoplankton and things like that live in these freshwater ecosystems and support the base of the food web. And so with that, it can create die-off and things like that and create an unhealthy environment in these river ecosystems. And following that, the main point of my study is focusing on how runoff from land of this nutrients and sediment can actually affect coral ecosystems. So as these nutrients and sediment are inputted into freshwater sources, as they flow downstream into the ocean, can these actually have an effect on coral ecosystems, which I will get into in the next couple of slides. So going to go ahead and continue from here into my first study. And the first study is over river discharge and how it reduces coral reef diversity in Palau. And so just to kind of go over a broad understanding of this study, it was more hypothesis based, and that'll make more sense once I go into my next study. But this experiment was based off more of a hypothesis. They set their hypothesis, they tested their hypothesis, and they got the results from their hypothesis from data collection. And so their hypothesis essentially was that with river runoff in terms of nutrients and sediment, it would create a decrease in coral growth and morality of corals, or an increase in morality, but a decrease in growth, and then would also affect richness and density in a negative aspect. And so they sought out to test this and see whether or not their hypothesis was correct. And so just to go over kind of where Palau is so that everyone knows, it's a small little island just outside the Philippines. So obviously west of the United States in the Pacific Ocean. But just to kind of continue into the methods of this study, it was conducted in the Ingermedu watershed or bay area. And basically what they did is they took 5 different sites, and each of these 5 sites varied in distance from the outlet of the river or the bay, which is this freshwater source that contains all of the nutrients and sediment. So starting off with site 1, site 1 is going to be the closest to the outlet. And then going on to site 2, 3, 4, and 5, they're going to get further and further and further from the outlet or from the source of this extra sediment and nutrients. And so basically what they wanted to see was whether or not this had an effect on their growth or morality, and whether or not this had an effect on their density and richness. So just to get into a little bit of the methods, I don't want to go over it too much because it's not really super important, but they took these cinder blocks, as you can see in the graph here on the right. These rectangles represent cinder blocks, and the stars and circles represent 2 different species of coral that they transplanted into these cinder blocks. And they placed 9 different cinder blocks, 3 for each different size of coral, into the freshwater and ecosystems, because in this case there's not an actual coral ecosystem. So they took these transplanted corals and placed them into water in order to see whether or not the nutrients and sediment would have an effect on them. And so basically what they did is they measured salinity levels, sediment levels, and nutrient levels across the board at each of the sites of varying distance, obviously, both before and after they put the corals in so they could see if there was any variation. And then after about 3 months, they came back and looked and measured at each of these things. So we're going to go over the results now of this study, which are the most important to kind of understanding this question that I'm going over. And so in the graph on the left-hand side is going to show you the sedimentation rate, which is a big part of this study. And as you can see in site 1, which is going to be the closest to the outlet of the bay, has the most, by far, the most high levels of sedimentation, or the suspended sediment. And as you go further and further away from this outlet to sites 2, 3, 4, and 5, you're going to have less sediment in terms of a gradient. So it's going to slowly decrease as it goes down. Each of these different color bars just represents different kinds of sediment. So it's not really necessarily something I want to focus on, but just so that everyone understands that. And then going over here to the graph on the right-hand side, I've locked out a few things just to make sure that it wasn't too confusing, and left the most important aspects to look at. But essentially what this graph is showing you on the right-hand side is this gradient. So if you look at the top row is going to be distance to the river mouth. Obviously, it's going to increase from site 1 to site 5, further and further away from the river mouth. And then salinity levels obviously are going to slowly increase as it gets further and further away from this freshwater source, which is the second row. And then you have suspended solid concentration, and that was measured both before and after. So you can see this gradient as well, where sediment is a lot higher, closer to the bay mouth or a river mouth. And as you get further and further away, it slowly decreases. And then the bottom section down here in terms of coral cover and everything like that, these are just the specific numbers. I wanted to incorporate them in there so that everyone could see them, but they're not necessarily most important. I feel like the trends are more important, which you'll see on this next slide that I'm about to go through. And so these are the main focus of the results of this study. And so if you look at graph A, it's going to be coral cover percentage on the y-axis and site on the x-axis. So coral cover percentage is going to increase slowly as you get further and further away from this source of nutrients and sediment levels. And so that's what they expected in terms of their hypothesis. You know, they were predicting that this would happen because this sediment and nutrients have a negative effect on corals. So coral cover percentage slowly increases the further and further away you get from this source of nutrients and resources and sediment, my bad. And so if you look at graph B, it's going to focus on adult coral richness on the y-axis and site again on the x-axis. And so adult coral richness is just going to be measured in terms of the diameter of the corals. They measured them before and after as well. And you can see the same trend, this slow gradual increase of coral richness as you get further and further away from these sediments and nutrients which are being emitted by the river. And so if you focus on C and D, they wanted to see whether or not this would affect juvenile corals, which I know is not necessarily part of my specific question, but it is important to understand that in juvenile corals, you can see an even greater trend. It starts off very low. The coral density, which is just going to be the weight of the corals, they measured before and after as well. You're going to see a significant increase as you get further and further away from this river outlet. And same with richness as well. You can see the trends are all increasing as you get further and further away from site 1 to site 5. And so one thing I did want to bring up, because I thought it was quite interesting, if you look at graph A in terms of coral cover percentage, you do see a decrease from between site 4 and site 5. And I scoured the paper and I couldn't necessarily find why. They never really explained it. But I think most likely it could be due to some, outside effects of different like confounding variables. They discussed how not a lot, but some of the corals, once they transplanted them into the water, got washed away because of the velocity of the water. So some of them got washed away. So it could have affected their data a little bit in terms of this chart, chart A. So I just wanted to make that clear because it doesn't follow the trends as well as you've seen the other three, but it does follow a similar trend. Okay, and now getting on to the second study, which is actually, I think is my favorite of the two studies just because of this picture right here on the front. And so this study, comparatively to the last one, which was more a hypothesis-driven study, is going to be an analytical and interpretive study. So basically what they just did is they took measurements at different sites around Puerto Rico and then took all of that data, collected it, and then interpreted that data in their discussion. So it was less of a experiment hypothesis-based study and was more of an analytical and interpretive study. And so this is Puerto Rico right here in this picture on the right-hand side. And if you look at sites A, B, C, and D, you can see these actual sediment plumes coming out from the river outlets. And so I'm going to get into that later, but I thought that was a really cool image to see. And so for the methods, I know I went over it a little bit in the last slide, but just to make sure that we understand everything going on here, obviously this study was conducted in Puerto Rico. There were 24 stream flow gauging stations. So if you look at the graph on the right, the stream flow gauging stations are just the solid blacked out triangles. And stream flow is just going to determine how fast a stream is flowing in terms of velocity and things like that, which can affect the amount of sediment and nutrients which are carried in the water. Higher velocities are going to carry more sediments and larger sediments and nutrients compared to lower velocity streams. And then if you look at the second point on the third point on the left-hand side, suspended sediment at 9 different stations. So they measured the suspended sediment at 9 different places around the Puerto Rican layout. And the sediment stations, if you look on the right-hand side under the explanation part, it's an upside down triangle with a little line out to the side of it. And so obviously this just measured the amount of suspended sediment that you can see in these river ecosystems. And then also 24 water quality stations, which is just referring to wastewater specifically, and how clean the water is in terms of waste. So those were measured around the Puerto Rican layout as well. But that's mainly the methods. They just took these stations, collected data from them, and then analyzed that data. So going into the results, and this graph on the left-hand side is actually going to be the most important, I think, to visualizing the situation that Puerto Rico is in right now. And so just to focus on something that I brought up in the beginning, the watersheds. If you look here on the left-hand side, these dark black lines are going to be the watershed. And the main watersheds in Puerto Rico are actually going to be split into the north, east, south, and west. So water is going to flow from central Puerto Rico, and depending on what watershed it is, it's going to flow to either the north coast, the east coast, the south coast, or the west coast. So that's kind of showing the dividing lines. And then also following that in the graph on the left-hand side, the darker gray arrows represent the sediment levels that are being emitted into these coral ecosystems from the land and from runoff of these rivers. And they're measured in tons per square kilometer, just to clear that up. But the arrows actually represent the caliber at which these sediments are being emitted. So the larger and thicker arrows are going to represent the larger emittance levels, and then the thinner arrows are going to represent the less emitted factors. So one important factor that I wanted to bring up in terms of this is if you look at the south and the west, they have very, very, very high levels of sediment being released out from these freshwater ecosystems and freshwater rivers. But if you look in the north, it's going to have a high water, just general water runoff compared to the other two of the west and the south. And the east is actually a lot smaller compared to the rest of them, so I didn't want to focus on that one as much, but you can kind of see the reason as to why this happens following figure 6, which is going to be here on the right, which is just showing rainfall levels in Puerto Rico. So if you focus on the bottom part, the darker dot in the middle is going to be the higher levels of rainfall, and as you go out from there, the lighter it gets, it's going to be less rainfall. And so this higher rainfall, obviously, it falls into the northern watershed, as you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, which is why this water runoff is so much significantly higher in the north. But in terms of that, the reason that a lot of the sediment is coming out in the south and in the west is actually going to be because of the high rainfall levels. They're flowing from higher levels of elevation to lower levels of elevation, carrying this sediment and nutrients out into the ocean. And so following that, I have another results slide, which incorporates that first picture that we saw on the title slide for this study. And then on the right-hand side, I'll get into that in a minute because that's actually quite interesting. So on the left-hand side is just a visual of these sediment plumes that are occurring because of the bad levels of sediment that are being emitted into these freshwater ecosystems in Puerto Rico. And they talked about it in the study, and a lot of this is actually coming from agriculture. And a lot of the agriculture can actually disrupt the soil and cause it to be loose, that when rain falls, it carries that soil with it, and sediment and nutrients from fertilizers and things like that in agriculture into these freshwater ecosystems and rivers, which then carries it out into the ocean, which you can see in A, B, C, and D. And it's actually crazy because this image is taken from space, and you can see how large these sediment plumes are coming out of Puerto Rico. And so in the graph on the right-hand side is going to focus more on how this actually impacts the corals. And I know we haven't talked about it much yet, but corals possess these zooxanthellae, which are photosynthesizing organisms which live with them in symbiosis, each benefiting from the other. And they provide essentially nutrients and oxygen for the corals to survive. And so as you can see, if you look at this graph on the left-hand side, chlorophyll A is being measured in terms of color. So the green is going to be higher chlorophyll A, yellow is going to be even higher than that. And this chlorophyll A is essentially representing the amount of phytoplankton levels in the ocean. And so phytoplankton are growing from this emittance of nutrients into the ocean. So phytoplankton are just another form of photosynthesizing organism. And so they normally float near the surface. And so when there's higher levels of these nutrients being pushed out into the ocean, these phytoplankton are able to grow in number. And this is actually what creates these algal blooms, which completely eliminate the sunlight from reaching the corals beneath and the other zooxanthellae beneath, which are able to keep the corals alive in terms of sunlight and photosynthesizing and producing oxygen so that the corals can live. And so if you look at the trend right here, you can see that especially in the south of Puerto Rico, but as well as in the north, this chlorophyll A level is significantly increasing. And that's due to the runoff of nutrients and sediment and things into the ocean. And so that's going to have a negative impact on these corals because they won't be able to receive the sunlight they need in order to survive. And so moving on from the results, I have another results page, which just focuses on the main things that they talked about in their discussion. Because in this study, they focused on not only the analytical data of sediment and nutrients and measuring things like that in terms of wastewater and all of that, but they also focused in their discussion specifically on how this affects coral reefs. So just running through this really quickly, obviously there's high levels of both sediment and water discharge across Puerto Rico, specifically because of these high agriculture levels, which they've also predicted to get worse in the future. As you know, we kind of lower income countries can also be more reliant on this agriculture, so it makes more sense for them to focus on agriculture rather than environmental factors. But high levels of nutrient discharge are important in terms of the algal blooms and negatively impacting corals. And in this study, they focus on nitrogen and phosphorus, which were the most important in terms of nutrients needed for the phytoplankton to grow and reproduce. And so the human factors that they talked about, obviously agriculture, but also wastewater, which is going to be impacting water quality, freshwater water quality specifically, but that obviously flows into the ocean. And then how this affects local coral reefs, obviously, as I've discussed before, these higher levels of nitrogen and phosphorus can lead to this growth of phytoplankton and algal blooms. And then obviously the sediment plumes are a significant factor, as you've seen in the picture on the previous slides. You can actually see how large these sediment plumes are due to this agricultural disturbance of the land and the runoff of rainfall. And so finally, getting into my take-home message, the four most important things that I kind of want everyone to take away from what I just talked about. So starting off, sediment and nutrients, obviously, these are going to inhibit coral growth and health. It's an important thing to understand, especially when it's something that you wouldn't necessarily think has an impact on corals. But this is also a major issue and is becoming worse, specifically with the increased levels of agriculture for food and increased levels of fertilizer use and things like that. All of that is running off into our freshwater ecosystems, freshwater rivers and streams, which is then flowing into the ocean and affecting these coral ecosystems. And so another thing, which I haven't touched on yet, but I think it's very important to take home from this presentation, is the fact that coral reefs serve as really, really important ecosystems. And they talked about it in the last study with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is really reliant on the coral reefs that surround their borders because of the amount of food that it provides for their people. It supports their economy. So not only does it have environmental impacts, but it also has important impacts on the specific countries that are reliant on these coral reef ecosystems. And these coral reef ecosystems also serve as a major point of diversity for all marine ecosystems around the globe. It's a major point of biodiversity. I mean, I'm sure everyone's seen pictures of coral reefs and just the pure amount of different species that live there. So they serve as major biodiversity sources. And so this obviously highlights our need for more research and awareness. A lot of lower income countries, as I mentioned before, don't necessarily have the ability to focus on environmental impacts of their agriculture and focusing in terms of runoff and with nutrients and sediment levels, specifically because, you know, everyone needs to eat, everyone needs to live. So In places where there's less income and they're more reliant on agriculture and things like that, it's going to be harder to focus on the environmental impacts. But this just highlights our need to do more research and, you know, increase the awareness of this issue that is currently getting worse and worse. And so here are my references for the 2 studies that I did. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone for watching my video, and yeah, thank you.